Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and today we will be going over the wide receiver tiers rankings that I have for the 2023 fantasy football season. This is the final video in this series of the early-ish rankings for each position, so if you haven't seen quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends videos are already out. In this video, I will be going through the players from wide receiver 1 through wide receiver number 44. This is top 44. I probably lied to you in the thumbnail and or the title of this video. Top 44 sounds weird. A couple of things I will be going through throughout the video. I will mostly not talk about everyone. I will be focusing on talking about 8 players who receive a standard format bump. I go out of, this is half PPR for my rankings, and 8 players who get a full PPR bump, as well as players who got a sleeper tag and an avoid tag. As far as both of those cases, those are purely based on my projections, and so this is how it works. As far as the standard and the full PPR, I changed my projections to not award any points for receptions, and then of course to award a full point for receptions. And I looked at the players who had the biggest increases from half PPR to each of those formats, standard and full PPR. As far as the sleepers and the avoid, gave them tags on, I use Fantasy Pros for my cheat sheet, gave them tags on there for a sleeper and avoid each. If they were 10 spots or better than the current ADP, then they got a sleeper tag. If they were 10 spots or worse for my projections specifically, then they got an avoid tag. These numbers over here are numbers that I try to help guide my my rankings and the number of players that I have in each of these tiers. That is data that is information based on the past few seasons and how many players ended up in these tiers where they were statistically, objectively better than the tier that they are ahead of and worse than the tier that they are behind. Before we get into this, just real quick, I will mention EV, or my equalized value system. The EV system, equalized value, is a system that I built in order to account for consistency more than just pure averages. As far as average points per week, you can think of it in a similar tone to how the average fantasy points per week would have ranked players last season. Like I said, it just accounts for consistency a little bit more though, because averages can be skewed pretty heavily from a really big game, really poor game, and it equalizes those the impacts that those big games in either direction have. Just to give a quick example of what that looks like, if a player were to score 60 points in 1 week and then 0 points for 2 weeks, and a different player scores 20 points each of those 3 weeks, both of those players averaged 20 fantasy points per week. However, the player that, according to my EV system, the player that scored 20 points each week would end up getting more equalized value points than the player who scored 60 points in that 1 week. And the main thing is I would prefer to have a guy who's on my team and helping me to win 3 weeks out of 3 weeks compared to having a guy who almost surely gave me a win 1 week, sure, but also made it very tough to win and gave me goose eggs in those other 2 weeks. And so that's where it just kind of equalizes things out. That is why I like the EV system. I prefer to have teams where everybody's pitching in each and every week. So let's get this started with the S-tier receivers, starting off with my wide receiver number 1. That is going to be, of course, Justin Jefferson. There you are. Last preseason, I had Justin Jefferson ranked number 1. Going to do that again. He was number 1 according to average fantasy points per week. My EV system, however, wasn't as high on him, ranked number 4. I think he's going to be more consistent this coming year because he has someone there in Jordan Addison now to help take away just a little bit of attention that defenses were able to focus on him, and good defenses or defenses that had a good day were able to shut Justin Jefferson down in a few games. I think we might be able to say that he's going to be even better, and that's going to bring us to my number 2 ranked wide receiver in Tyreek Hill. I was too low on Tyreek Hill last season. I am not going to be too low on him this year. It appears that I'm going to be too high on him this year, at least as far as where I ranked him compared to ADP. When Tua was the quarterback for the Dolphins last season, Tyreek Hill was absolutely a very sexy receiver to have. Even without Tua being there all season long, Tyreek still finished as wide receiver 3 in average fantasy points per week and wide receiver 2 via my EV system. So yeah, I think there's a very good chance that he could be the wide receiver 1 this season. Everything goes right. That's why I have him in this wide receiver 1 upside tier. Just these two. We're going to move on to this next tier. Top 3 wide receiver tier. I have 3 wide receivers in this, all vying to be a top 3 wide receiver, whether it be wide receiver 1, 2, or 3. That's not really the big thing. It's just that I think that there's a less chance that they'll be the wide receiver 1. But I think guys like Jamar Chase, who I have as my wide receiver 3, have a good shot of being a top 3 wide receiver next season. Now, I just moved him up while I was preparing for this video. Did a few updates to my rankings just in the last day here. Jamar Chase I had at wide receiver 5. Looked at things a little bit closer. And, you know, especially based on how he did last season, I got to say, okay, yeah, you're going to be up here at my wide receiver 3. So what can I say? Jamar Chase is great. And then we have Cooper Kupp here next. And if Stafford is coming into this season banged up, I'm going to be less high on Cooper Kupp. Probably put him back at, I figured it would be like my wide receiver 7. I don't want to say who in front of or behind right now. Keep that a little bit of a mystery. But I would drop him down a little ways. As far as if Stafford's coming in, he has the potential to be a number 1 wide receiver, at least while Stafford's healthy. It's the big thing. Stafford has been really, really beat up throughout his entire career. He's older now. He's been a tough mother effer and really, really come back through and played through a lot of injuries. Not even come back, played through them. I think he's kind of past that point in his career. We saw it last season. He wasn't able to play through some stuff. Had surgery, big surgery. I have concerns about that, and so that is really just lowering my expectations for this offense in general, but it's possible that he has a great season, and then guys on that offense are going to be better than we're expecting. There's going to be more coming from that offense than we're anticipating, and that brings me to my wide receiver number 5, Stephon Diggs. Great offense, great player, and I can't keep him out of here. I have high expectations, as I do every season, for him. Hopefully this season, with some of the changes that they made for him, that will help to open things up, and we could see the Stephon Diggs of 2 seasons ago when he was the wide receiver. I can't remember. Maybe it was 3, 2, right up there. Maybe 1? I don't think so. That's it for my, we could call these my elite players, my S tier guys. We're going to move on to my A tier, and that is going to start off with A.J. Brown. He's a great wide receiver. I think when he's healthy, one of the best in the league. Absolutely love him. There are some of those knee concerns. You still got to be a little bit concerned about that flaring up. But more so, it's just the offense. He's not going to be a 150 target guy. You got Devontae Smith there. DeAndre Swift just came in. And so it's a high efficiency touchdown kind of game with him. Quarterback is going to take off and run too. Just there's a little bit of volatility that you have to take into account with a guy like A.J. Brown. But when it's good, it's really, really good. And most weeks, it's going to be pretty darn good. And that's going to bring us up to CeeDee Lamb. Just expecting him to take a little bit of a step forward with, once again, getting a weapon opposite of him that I think will help his consistency, which was the biggest issue last season. There were some games where teams were just able to key in on him and limit the upside and shut him down. So with Brandon Cooks coming in, I have high expectations for CeeDee Lamb, which is why I have him up ahead of my number 7 wide receiver, Davante Adams. And I just can't go higher than this for Davante Adams due to the offense and the quality of the quarterback that he's getting is not going to be anything improved from last season. Via EV, Adams was ranked 7th in my charts last year, despite being 4th in average fantasy points per game. That's because he was incredibly inconsistent. He had 4 huge games, but he also had 2 games where he scored fewer than 2.5 fantasy points, 1 game where he scored fewer than 5 fantasy points, and 2 games where he scored fewer than 9 fantasy points. To give an idea, I looked at each of these guys and how they did last season in each of those 3 scoring cutoffs that I kind of artificially made here, and this is what I came up with. Cooper Kupp, he got injured in a game, the only game where he qualified for any of those, 9 points or fewer, 5 points or fewer, 2.5 points or fewer in that game that he got injured. Must have happened pretty early on. He had less than 2.5 points. Tyreek Hill had 1 game with fewer than 5 fantasy points. That's it. Everything else above 9 fantasy points. Jamar Chase had 2 games with fewer than 9 fantasy points, none fewer than 5 or 2.5. Justin Jefferson had 1 with fewer than 2.5, 2 fewer than 5, 1 fewer than 9. But I'm thinking that Jordan Addison is going to help his consistency. I just don't have any reason to believe that Davante Adams' situation has improved to the same extent that Justin Jefferson has. Now, I wrote that down here as a talking point, and at the same time, maybe I wasn't thinking about the fact he is getting back Hunter Renfrow, and they added Jacoby Myers as well. So those things will definitely help, should take away some of that real big downside for Davante Adams, assuming Jimmy Garoppolo is there and healthy. Otherwise, I don't know about that quarterback situation. Then we really start to get to asking some questions. Let's continue this list with Stephon Diggs. He had 2 games with fewer than 9 points, 2 games fewer than 5 points. And then A.J. Brown had 1 game with less than 5 points, 1 game less than 2.5 points, no other games less than 9 points. CeeDee Lamb had 1 game with less than 5 points, 4 games with less than 9 points. In general, all these guys, I think, were much more consistent outside of Justin Jefferson, but his ceiling was just so huge, and we don't have a reason to believe that Davante Adams has that same ceiling in his offense. Then we're going to come up with Amon-Ra St. Brown, and next up, my wide receiver 9. And Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be our first PPR, full PPR. He gets a small full PPR bump for him. I would probably take him over Davante Adams, especially thinking of some of those other concerns with the quarterback situation there right now. I would take him over Davante Adams in full PPR. That's about all the bump that gives me. I wouldn't take him over CeeDee Lamb. And that's going to bring up Jalen Waddle as my wide receiver 10. And he receives a decent standard scoring bump. No impact on his full PPR projections for me. No impact on the thoughts there. I would definitely think about taking Jalen Waddle over Adams and Amon-Ra St. Brown in standard scoring, just because I think that there's going to be more touchdowns for that Miami offense while everybody's healthy, at least, for that offense compared to these two teams. And so in standard scoring, I will take that. Also, just pure efficiency should be higher for Waddle than at least St. Brown. I would think about taking him over those two. I don't know if I could actually pull that trigger. It's close. Let's bring up the last guy in this tier, Chris Olave. Projections loved him. I understand it. I'm not going to argue with it. So he is my wide receiver 11. And these guys are all guys who I think are highly likely to be wide receiver 1s at the end of the 2023 season. My confidence does start to wane at the back end of this for Waddle and Chris Olave specifically. Just barely make it into this tier compared to being in this next tier of mine. Originally, I actually had Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave in a tier of their own between these two tiers, to give you an idea of where my lines kind of start to get crossed for half PPR specifically. But let's move on to my B tier. At this point, just about 10 wide receivers in, the wide receiver group, it's becoming a hodgepodge. From the top to the bottom of tier B to tier C, I'm really not, ultra confident in exactly where I have these guys ranked against one another. There's a lot of similarity between these groups of players. There's a lot of arguments you can make for putting guys up a couple of spots, moving them back a few spots. First up in this tier is a guy who, we'll see if I keep him this high, but Amari Cooper, expecting that offense to be much improved, expecting Deshaun Watson to be much improved. We've seen how you could hyper-target a guy like DeAndre Hopkins in the past. We've seen that Amari Cooper can be a true number 1 and demand those targets. So yeah, I think there's a definite chance for a guy like Amari Cooper to be a top 12 wide receiver. And that's what this tier is. It's going to be a rather much larger tier than the previous tiers. And these are going to be all the guys who I think could end up as wide receiver 1s. And right behind him, I have Keenan Allen. When he's healthy, on a good offense, he's very good, gets a lot of targets. And next up, we're going to have Garrett Wilson, who I have an avoid tag on. He has an ADP of 10 currently, and even with a 24% target share, which may be higher while Breece Hall is out, if he is out at all for the start of the season. But even with that 24% target share, he projected as wide receiver 21 for me. I have him ranked as wide receiver 14, but I have to warn you, just throw a little caution into the wind here. Historically, being a Green Bay Packers fan, Aaron Rodgers really has not peppered his slot receivers with a lot of targets. He likes to push the ball downfield. Up until this point in his career, his best slot receiver that he has ever had, Randall Cobb's best 3 seasons, he ended up as the wide receiver 7. So we know the potential to be a wide receiver 1's there. Also as wide receiver 16 and wide receiver 24. And those are the best 3 seasons. So I hope I'm wrong on this, but I am concerned about taking Garrett Wilson as a wide receiver 1. Now, why could I be wrong about this? Well, because Garrett Wilson will probably now be the best single slot wide receiver that Aaron Rodgers has ever had to pass to. Additionally, as Aaron Rodgers ages, getting the ball downfield as efficiently as he used to becomes less of a sure thing. So these shorter targets should be more attractive to him. I will say there's also some raw statistical stats from last season to suggest that maybe Aaron Rodgers started taking some of those shorter throws more often. I can say in watching the games, it didn't really feel like there was much of a difference. And I know I was still hooting and hollering at the screen sometimes to just take the free yardage. And up next we have T. Higgins, a guy who I moved back in my rankings just a little bit in my most recent rankings change. And nothing really to talk about him. Bringing up Terry McLaurin, a guy who has a sleeper tag coming up next up in my rankings. And he ended up as my wide receiver 13 based on my projections, not my rankings here. And so I'm optimistic about what Sam Howell and this offense might look like next season. Am I, Terry McLaurin, as a surefire wide receiver 2 optimistic? I'm not so sure about that. Should I move him back further behind the next 2, 3, 4 guys? Let me know if you think I should move him back behind any of these guys specifically. And up next in my projections, we have Christian Watson, another sleeper who did even better in my projections. And he is the offense for the Green Bay Packers. They will try to get the ball in his hands as much as humanly possible. They're going to scheme up plays for him, just like the Vikings did for Justin Jefferson last season. Exactly why I had Justin Jefferson as my wide receiver 1 in my rankings before the season last year is the same reason that I'm really excited for the potential for Christian Watson. There are just enough concerns, issues to be a little bit cautious with where I rank him, how high I rank him, but I think it's very, very much possible that he ends up as a wide receiver 1. You know, I saw the Packers uniform. I got excited. I took him. You can't say that Allen Lazard doesn't look young for his age, but, I mean, Christian Watson looks like a 12-year-old. I don't know why I made that mistake. There's Christian Watson in the right spot. Right behind him, I have Davante Adams right here. Sometimes I'm just not thinking as I grab the pictures of these guys, and I just go with it. But Davante Adams up next in my wide receiver rankings, ranked wide receiver 18. Good God. Devonta Smith. I was just going to start re-recording, but screw it. We'll keep that error in there. And behind him, I have Tyler Lockett, who is another sleeper for me. For the second year in a row, Lockett has outprojected DK Metcalf. Last year, I think I ended up, I can't recall, in the draft, I ended up taking DK Metcalf instead of him, and I think the end of my season could have been different if I had Tyler Lockett. I don't remember how he did down the stretch, but I was just one player away from a championship last season. I'm not making that mistake again. I'm sticking to the projections here. Tyler Lockett really didn't show any signs of slowing down, and my projections were correct last year. Lockett ended up as the wide receiver 15 in both average fantasy points per week and in my EV system, whereas DK Metcalf was the 24th fantasy wide receiver via both EV and fantasy average fantasy points per week. And that's going to bring us up to my next receiver in Jerry Jeudy. I'm expecting that offense to be much improved this season, and so there's a guy who's going to really benefit from that. It's probably Jerry Jeudy. And that's going to bring up DeAndre Hopkins, who actually did move back a few slots when he got cut. I said I was keeping him pretty much right where I had him. I mean, we're still pretty much there, but given the teams that it appears he might be going to, Tennessee Titans, New England Patriots, at this point in time of recording this video, he has not signed anywhere. I very well might by the time that this video gets out. I was higher up on thinking that DeAndre Hopkins was going to go to a team like Buffalo or Kansas City, something like that, where it was like, yeah, I'm not drafting him any bit lower. But as of right now, it just doesn't look like he's going to get to that caliber of a team. I still think if he goes to either of those teams, he gets a lot of targets and has a good chance of being quite successful. But personally, I would prefer New England Patriots. I'd be a little bit more interested in him in fantasy football. And also for reasons of Treylon Burks, I would prefer he went there just because I think it's very easy to be excited about Treylon Burks right now because he's like the only receiver there. And also it's easy to be kind of high up on Chigozie Magakwo. DeAndre Hopkins goes there. That really it starts to it throws some stuff into the fan for those two. And as you see, I have DK Metcalf up behind him in my rankings, followed by Deebo Samuel behind DK Metcalf. And to wrap this up as my wide receiver 24 perfectly at the end of this tier, we have Calvin Ridley. And Calvin Ridley's a guy who's going to get a small full PPR bump, and I can't argue with that. It's a pass-heavy offense, and there should be some games where he gets 10-plus targets this season, several of them. Is it enough to push him up ahead of Deebo Samuel? It's close. I think maybe. I do have Jerry Jeudy ranked fairly high here. In my projections, Calvin Ridley actually jumped ahead of Jerry Jeudy and all the way up ahead of T. Higgins in my projections for the full PPR projections. Just something to keep in mind with him for full PPR compared to my ranking here for half PPR. And so those are all the receivers that would I be shocked if they are wide receiver ones? Absolutely not. But now we're going to move into the first portion of my C tier. Now this tier used to be much larger. Calvin Ridley used to be in this tier, but I ended up bumping him up a little ways. Not rankings-wise, just as far as putting him into this other tier instead. And there were a few guys that I had. There's been a lot of shuffling with this tier, and now it's much thinner. It used to be 9 or 10. It's down to 6 guys, and I would say, let's see, 4 or 5 guys have then changed within here. We're going to start this tier off, though, with a consistent one in Christian Kirk. Just kind of like the CeeDee Lamb argument, the Justin Jefferson argument, with them getting some other weapons. The Stephon Diggs hopeful argument of these guys having somebody else there to take some of the pressure off of them so teams can't just absolutely lock them down. And of course, I mean, I would say this about Cooper Kupp. The thing is, we've seen time and time again that Cooper Kupp still does it, even if he's triple teamed. So I can't quite say it about him. But these other guys, they need somebody else to just take a little bit of the edge off of them. And with Calvin Ridley joining, I don't think it's going to kill the value of Christian Kirk. I think they're going to eat from a better plate than there was last season even here, and both be quite successful guys. And then we're going to see Marquise Brown come in here. And so this tier, weekly top 12 upside, these tier 4 guys in this tier are just all guys that I think we'll see several weeks where they are, top 12 wide receivers are very close to in scoring. But when all is said and done at the end of the season, I don't really see them finishing as a top 12 wide receiver, but they should finish as one several times throughout the season. And Marquise Brown's definitely going to have an opportunity for that, being the number 1 wide receiver here for the Arizona Cardinals. He receives a mediocre full PPR bump. Of note is that his standard scoring drop is much larger, and I'm in full agreement of both ends of that spectrum. I would not have Marquise Brown this high in standard formats, not expecting a whole lot of touchdowns for him, just a lot of receptions. As far as a full PPR goes, I still wouldn't push him up any further than where I have him ranked, because I think my half PPR ranking here has him at approximately his ceiling already. I probably have him ranked essentially as if I was ranking him for full PPR. And that's going to bring up Mike Williams next up on my rankings. He is my wide receiver 27, and he receives a standard scoring bump in standard scoring formats. And this is exactly why I have Marquise Brown and Mike Williams ranked in this order. For purposes of half PPR, I would rather take a shot at the most consistent guy out of these two, who is the number 1 target in his offense, and that's Marquise Brown, compared to the high upside, inconsistent Mike Williams. But when it comes to standard scoring, give me the guy who is on the better offense, who has the better, yardage efficiency, I think, out of the two. Not that Marquise Brown's is terrible. He's a good intermediate to deep target guy. But I will say, in terms of touchdowns, I don't have a big separation between these two. And obviously, that's a huge factor for standard format scoring, because I think Marquise Brown will have a higher percentage of his team's touchdowns. However, Arizona Cardinals are going to have fewer touchdowns than the Los Angeles Chargers, whereas I think Mike Williams gets a smaller percentage of the team's overall touchdowns, but at the end of the day, those could weigh themselves to be a fairly equal amount of touchdowns between these two. But if I had to bet on one of them to get more touchdowns, which is going to be my tiebreaker for standard formats, I would go with Mike Williams. So in standard formats, I would actually take Mike Williams all the way up ahead of Christian Kirk. I would put him behind Calvin Ridley, ahead of Christian Kirk, probably still in the same tier, so ahead of Christian Kirk. And right behind Mike Williams in my half-ppr rankings, I have a DJ Moore, a guy who has an avoid tag. As a reminder, avoid tag specifically refers to where my projections landed compared to the average ADP. And I don't think that in this offense for DJ Moore that there are enough targets to justify an ADP of wide receiver 22, which is where he is currently going. There are too many questions about this offense and Justin Fields as a passer. I've already bumped him up in my rankings a few spots. I believe before doing my most recent change, I had him at the back end of this tier, so maybe 4 or 5 spots even lower than this. And I'm still debating on moving him up even a little bit more. But here's the thing. And by a little bit more, I mean all the way up to in front of this tier is a possibility, which would put him at wide receiver 25, so very close to ADP. Here's my big concerns for him. Even with a 26% target share, which is what I projected him for, he still came out as my wide receiver 39. And I'm sure that has a lot and everything to do with my concerns about the amount of targets that are going to be available in this offense each and every week. This is an offense that has not received a philosophical change of mind in the offseason, so I've got concerns about him. If I have DJ Moore ranked up at wide receiver 25, he's not going to be a target of mine. Right about here, though, I don't want to say excited about drafting him, but if all of these guys ahead of him are gone, I am confident in drafting him that I will hopefully not regret it, I suppose. And that's going to bring us to the end of this portion of this tier, starting off with this next tier, which is going to be a bit of a drop off, especially in the description here. The description is high-end wide receiver 3s, because that's where we are at now. And I think that these 2 receivers that I now have in this tier, used to be 4 or 5 receivers, have a good chance at being high-end wide receivers, receiver 3s. And that's going to start off with Brandon Cooks, who is a sleeper. And just like 2 years ago, I think that the community has Brandon Cooks absolutely wrong. Cooks is still at the backside of his prime. He's 29 or 30 years old maybe once the season gets going. He's coming off of a mostly healthy season, just had a calf strain in week 12. Don't think that's going to affect him moving forward. And he's on a much better offense with the Cowboys. And he will have a much better quarterback with Dak Prescott. He is a wide receiver 3 who may be slightly inconsistent. Maybe. His current ADP of wide receiver 43 is assuming that he's going to be the same guy that he was last season with what's his name throwing to him at quarterback on an offense that focused very, very heavily on the running the game. It just makes absolutely zero sense to me to put him on that same radar. Like, that's literally, I think, wide receiver 42 or 43 is where he ended up last season. So I don't see how you could expect the same thing for him. He'll have to be I would say he'll have to be a much worse player than he has ever been to back that up. Last season was by far his worst season since his rookie season. And I just don't think he's going to repeat that once again in this new offense with a better quarterback. I don't see it. So draft him higher than where he's going. Next up, we have Chris Godwin in this tier, high-end wide receiver 3. He does receive a mediocre full PPR bump, and there's a bigger concern for him in standard formats. That being said, I have a tough time. Projections are based on past data, to at least they influence projections heavily. You try to account for for factors moving into the future as much as possible, but you have to use past data, and last year's past data is not very accurate, I don't think, for what we should expect of this offense this season, and as well as his efficiency. He had that injury, was definitely hampering him, and Tom Brady, I just don't think had the ability to throw the ball deep anyways, even if it wasn't hampering him. But still, we saw his average depth of target go up as the season went along. So Chris Godwin should be back to himself this season. That's definitely going to be helpful for him. And that's where I think this mediocre full bump, big standard format concerns come from, especially with where I have him ranked. I wouldn't bother moving him in either of those formats. What I do think is that it's tough in any format to have too much confidence on what this offense will look like this coming season with the quarterbacks that they have. The range of outcomes is pretty wide, but it starts off pretty low and goes to above average. Doesn't even go into good or great or anything like that, in my opinion. Let's move on to this last tier, pretty big tier of wide receivers. And it's going to start off with, it should be a surprise here, in Allen Lazard as my wide receiver 31. Now, obviously, he has a sleeper tag on him. Here's the thing. Allen Lazard is Aaron Rodgers' boy, and this is part of why I'm not as high on Garrett Wilson as others are. I do have probably a higher target share going, almost certainly, higher target share going to Allen Lazard than a lot of rankers have, and I have, that eats into some of the target share then that you would give Garrett Wilson. I think that Lazard is going to produce at a similar level to how he produced last year with the Packers. An ADP of wide receiver 52 is too low for Allen Lazard, who finished 37th in average fantasy points per week, and via my EV system, he finished as wide receiver 30. Now, the ceiling for Allen Lazard, I know, is not great, but the floor should be perfect for a wide receiver 3 in 2 wide receiver leagues. I'd probably look for a little bit more upside in a 3 wide receiver league where you're starting. I don't want to be starting Allen Lazard every single week, that's for sure. And so from that sense, I probably need to move Allen Lazard back a little ways, and I will. I just have a little bit of trouble with the guys that I have immediately behind him. Just fine moving him back. So let me know what you think about the guys that I have immediately behind him and how far back, if in my reality, how far back would you push him, given the fact that I think he'll have a similar year to last year. Back to wide receiver 3 leagues, though, I would be happy to have him as a wide receiver 4 in those kind of leagues. A guy who can platoon in based on matchups, injuries, and or bye weeks. I think that's where he'll be a very good fantasy asset. Maybe that's not a high-end wide receiver 3, where I kind of have him at ADP 31. But let's get to those guys I have immediately behind him. I have Mike Evans right behind him, wide receiver 32, and then I have Drake London right behind him. So, I expressed my concerns about the offense there for Tampa Bay for Mike Evans with the quarterback. I think Mike Evans has had over 1,000 receiving yards in every year of his career, maybe. I think that reign might come to an end here, and touchdowns are going to be tougher to come by. That's really been a big part of his success as a fantasy wide receiver. So I definitely have concerns for Mike Evans. And then Drake London, the offense, they're going to want to run a lot. Are they going to have a lot of touchdowns? Those are question marks. We have question mark at the quarterback position. It's not that I don't like Ritter, but there's still a lot of unknown with him. How much of an upside do we really have here for Drake London? Think Allen Lazard to compare him to Drake London, be in an offense that's going to pass more, probably have more at least receiving touchdowns. And so more attempts, more receiving touchdowns. Not the same amount of efficiency per catch, I wouldn't say, as Drake London, though. Is that going to be enough? I don't know. For standard purposes, I would say yes, for sure. Now, let's keep moving on because we don't have any tags on either of these guys, but we do next up here, Michael Pittman, my wide receiver 34, and he gets a big full PPR bump. And as far as standard format goes, there's big concerns for him in standard format. Now, remember, these are projection-based things based on historical data, and last year, Pittman was utilized in a strange way, I would say, for the type of wide receiver that he is in this offense. He received a lot of targets and a lot of short. I think he's a deep ball, contested catch kind of guy. So they used him in a weird way. Regardless of how they use him, I can't say that I have a whole lot of confidence in him this year anyways. I am doubtful that they will be using him on a lot of short throws again. Just doesn't seem like the wisest utilization of his skill set. I can say that I don't agree with these results, that he should get a big bump in full PPR, and for standard formats, you could put him even lower. I would prefer Pittman in standard format compared to full PPR. And that's going to bring us to Deontay Johnson, who receives a mediocre full PPR bump. No real changes for his standard format concerns for him. I'd keep him right here for standard format. Full PPR, you can move him up a little ways, I think. He's still the #1 wide receiver for Pittsburgh, I think, going forward. Right behind him, I have Treylon Burks, a guy who receives a standard format bump. And I wouldn't argue against that compared to full PPR. But as far as my ranking of him for half PPR purposes, I just don't think that I would want to put him any higher in half PPR, standard format scoring, full PPR. I think that I have him ranked roughly at his ceiling. That being said, there are reasons I want to push him up higher, but I also have, clear concerns for that offense and how many touchdowns that they're going to get. I don't think it's going to be as good of an offense as Atlanta's even. So a better quarterback probably, maybe, at least for part of the season. And Treylon Burks is going to have to step up, which I think could happen. So there's potential there. Now let's move on to the next wide receiver I have behind him, Courtland Sutton. I'd say the biggest concern that I have, especially as the year goes along for Courtland Sutton, would be Marvin Mims. I think Marvin Mims, initially, he's a bigger threat to Tim what's-his-name's role in this offense. But if he develops a little bit as an all-around wide receiver, if he proves himself that, I think he could take away some of the work from Courtland Sutton as the year goes along. So do have some concerns about that, but at least not to open up the season unless in training camp there's, some real crazy raving reviews about Marvin Mims. After that, we have Rashad Bateman. We are up to my wide receiver 39, and Rashad Bateman has a sleeper tag on him. And I'm not sold on the fact that Odell Beckham Jr. will be some target-dominating beast. Now, that said, early portion of the training camp here, a lot of good comments coming out from guys about OBJ, but I don't know, you don't want to buy into those kinds of hypes too much. This offense should be more pass-heavy, however, and Bateman really looked great in the small sample that we've had from him when he's been healthy. I do think that he's already not fully healthy coming into the 2023 season, so that is a little bit concerning. But like I said, in the small sample size, he upside's really good for him. Should be more passing there. And he also received a decent standard format bump with a rather large full PPR concern for him. I would say mitigate both of those. I would give him a small bump for standard purposes, maybe put him up ahead of Courtland Sutton, maybe. And then for full PPR, I might move him. I don't think I would really move him back at all, really, considering where I have him ranked. And right behind him, I have Brandon Ayuk. And Brandon Ayuk gets a standard format bump. But first of all, for my ranking here, his ranking is heavily reliant on the quarterback situation there. Who will the quarterback be for him? If it looks like Trey Lance is going to be getting a shot and will be starting the season as their quarterback, then this is where I have him ranked for that reason, because that is currently what it seems like to me is the most likely situation. But if Brock Purdy suddenly looks really healthy, like he's a lock to come in early season and be back, if he happens to be the quarterback one, if he heals up before the season, then we're definitely jumping Brandon Ayuk up quite a ways from here, at the very least up to the front of this tier, maybe up to about this tier here, with DJ Moore, or right in front of Brandon Cooks. Somewhere right in there. And I want to make it clear, though, before I move on, as far as Trey Lance goes as the quarterback there, the reasoning for docking some of these guys, these receivers, isn't necessarily because I think that the team's way worse with Trey Lance in at quarterback. It's because it's a totally different system that they're not system, but it's a totally different way of running this system. And there's going to be fewer passing attempts per game. And of course, Trey Lance's receiving, the amount of receptions per balls thrown isn't very high. Kind of like a Jalen Hurts early career issue with him. And so all of these guys will get fewer targets, catch fewer of those targets, and it really just makes them incredibly inconsistent, in my opinion. They're going to be touchdown reliant. Almost all the receivers for this offense if Trey Lance is the quarterback. Next up, we have wide receiver Nico Collins right behind Brandon Ayuk, and he gets a sleeper tag. Even the worst of offenses can produce a wide receiver 3 or 4 out of their number 1 wide receiver. An ADP of wide receiver 62 for who we assume to be the number 1 wide receiver on this team feels a little bit too low to me, and this team could be better than they were last season. I'll be happy to take a shot on Nico as my wide receiver 5, thinking that he has high-end wide receiver 3 upside and a floor, I think, of being a wide receiver 4. There is a floor for him that maybe isn't worth of being wide receiver 41 like I currently have him ranked, but is definitely worth targeting by wide receiver 51. The other thing that I'll be keeping my eye on with Nico Collins would be the development off-season news regarding him and John Mechie. John Mechie's my boy. Have high hopes for him. I'm still thinking for now that Nico Collins is the wide receiver 1 there. But I'm going to keep my eye on the offseason news between those two, because maybe it'll be John Mechie that I want to move up a little bit, move Nico Collins back a little bit. But ADP of 62 is a steal for him right now. Michael Thomas coming up next in my rankings. Not much to say about Michael Thomas. He could definitely be a good wide receiver 2 if everything goes well. So he could be a wide receiver 1. We know that. So there's plenty of upside with Michael Thomas, but there's plenty of reasons to be concerned. And guess what? We're going to play a little game here where does Jordan Addison go? Because I totally skipped Jordan Addison. He goes right behind Treylon Burks. My bad on Jordan Addison. He is my wide receiver 37. He was a recent move up for me. I didn't see him hanging out down here, but Jordan Addison, I have high hopes for. Like I said, he just with the exit of Dalvin Cook, that increased the target share that I have dedicated to him just a little bit. Wasn't big, but it was a pretty big jump in the projections from that little bump that he received to his target share. I was already planning on moving him up a little bit, but that ensured it. So moved him up here ahead of Courtland Sutton, just right behind Treylon Burks. The biggest thing for me with Jordan Addison is that I wasn't a big believer of him in the pre-draft process. I thought he was more of a round 2 guy compared to where he got taken. So I do have some concerns about him coming in and being a really good wide receiver and being the distraction to Justin Jefferson. But I do think that he'll be better than what they had last year, KJ Osborne and whatnot. So it's a really, really good opportunity for Jordan Addison. He could be a wide receiver 2 if everything goes really, really well for him. So that's possible. Now let's move on to getting back on track here. Behind Michael Thomas, we have Gabe Davis next up from my wide receiver 43, I think that would be. And is there much to say about Gabe? He receives a big standard scoring bump, small full PPR decrease, and I'm going to agree with that. That makes total sense. He didn't show up last season when he was asked to be, the big target share kind of guy. He just wasn't able to demand that kind of target share. He could always still develop a little bit further yet. He's relatively young, but, for now, given what we know, this is where he goes. And then we have Jacoby Myers to finish this tier up. And Jacoby Myers gets a sleeper tag. He projected out as my wide receiver 40. I'm not confident in Jacoby Myers being this high, but I reduced the target share that he demanded last season by 6%. Pretty substantial decrease. And it fit in, with the new offense that he's on there for the Raiders just fine. There is potential upside here for Jacoby Myers. They got rid of Darren Waller at tight end. That opened up some targets for him. The other tight ends that they have, running backs, aren't really a big threat to the receivers' target shares on this offense. So I think that does go his way. he will probably end up closer to his current ADP of wide receiver 53 than where I have him ranked here at wide receiver 44. But just don't sleep on Jacoby Myers. There is some decent upside there. Of course, we do have those concerns for Jimmy Garoppolo, but I think that he's going to be fine outside of some crazy circumstances. Not crazy, but some bad healing circumstances going on. I did add another guy who I don't have a picture for here as my wide receiver 45 into this tier, and that was Juju Smith-Schuster. Just bumped him up a notch when I went through and redid some of my rankings. Didn't redo a whole lot of them, and that's it for my top 44 or 45 if you want to put Juju Smith right in there. Receivers with their tiers. There are a couple of things we can finish this up for. First, I'm going to go through the top 44 via ADP that I don't have in my top 44. There are 4 players that I didn't get in here that should be in here according to ADP. So the first player that is getting drafted in the top 44, not my top 44, is ranked my wide receiver 47, is George Pickens, who for some reason his picture got into this list of mine. I think this offense will be better than it was last season, but not that much better, and I think they're going to refocus on the rushing attack as well. I still think that Deontay Johnson is the wide receiver 1 of this offense. So the question for me is how consistent / reliant Pickens will be as an option. I don't know how confident I would feel week in and week out of putting him out there, but he is on the edge of being into this tier. Very, very close. Same with the next guy who is 1 spot behind him in my rankings, Jahan Dotson, my wide receiver 48 currently. And it's pretty much the same story as George Pickens. Big difference for me between the two, why I have George Pickens ahead of Jahan Dotson by a spot, is I prefer the offense of Pittsburgh over the offense of Washington, as well as the fact that I think that Curtis Samuel demands a higher target share than the slot receivers of Pittsburgh Steelers do. So I just think there's a higher chance that George Pickens, out of those two, has a good season. Then Jackson Smith-Njigba is a guy who I don't have in here, and I have him ranked quite a bit lower. I have him as my wide receiver 57. I definitely recognize the upside here with Jackson Smith-Njigba, but this is a rush-heavy offense with a quarterback that there are question marks on, despite putting together a great season last year. Tyler Lockett didn't show signs of slowing down, as I mentioned earlier last year. The upside is there, but I'm not betting on it. I don't think that there's going to be enough targets left over for Jackson Smith to be consistent enough for fantasy football. I love him for the Seahawks in real life football, but unless he gets a high percentage of touchdowns for this team, I just don't think that you're going to find yourself with a guy who you can rely on. And I think you'll find yourself chasing points with him. You have him on your bench that big week, he goes off, then you play him, you're disappointed. That's not what I want from a wide receiver 3, like his ADP currently suggests. Then we have Kadarius Toney being drafted in the top 44 ADP. I have him ranked all the way back at wide receiver 64, and I definitely see the upside for Kadarius Toney. I almost prefer Kadarius Toney over Jackson Smith-Njigba. Maybe I'll change those rankings. Despite seeing this potential upside, I think that ultimately he gets used in a bit of a gadgety way for this offense. I think that he takes over some of that Mecole Hardman role. So I think that he'll be on the field enough to be fantasy relevant, but I just think that the ball gets spread way too thinly between the current wide receiver group, which I think is 4 or 5 deep, that'll be getting on the field, kind of just like last season. And then you have McKinnon on top of that and Travis Kelce on top of that taking targets, and I have him in the same tier here as Jackson Smith-Njigba, which is mostly my high upside tier. Guys who I think should definitely get drafted, but still, guys who borderline wide receiver 3/4 is just a little bit rich for me on them. In a 2 wide receiver league, I would want Kadarius Toney as my wide receiver 4. And in a 3 wide receiver league, I would want him as my wide receiver 5. I don't find him to be a super reliable guy as much as a high upside guy. And so those are my concerns for Kadarius Toney. I could be very wrong with him. Before wrapping this up, I do have a couple more things. These are quick. Half PPR bumps, guys who ranked higher in half PPR in my projections than they did in both the full PPR and the standard scoring formats when I altered my projections for that. And those 3 players that are in this list are DK Metcalf, Cortland Sutton, and Drake London. Here's going to be another list of guys who you could also kind of think as being best in half PPR because they ended up either equal to their projection in both formats, then in half PPR, or they were equal to their half PPR projection in one format while they were lower in it in another format, or higher in half PPR than in the other format that they weren't equal to. So that's Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Christian Watson, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams, Chris Olave, Tyler Lockett, T. Higgins, Keenan Allen, Nico Collins, Darnell Mooney, Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Cooks are all going to be, to a lesser extent, half PPR guys, in addition to the DK Metcalf, Cortland Sutton, Drake London guys. And then I have four guys here, two full PPR bumps who were unlisted. They were top 48 guys in my projections, but not, they didn't make my top 44 list here. Rondale Moore gets a full PPR bump, definitely in agreement with that. Other guy who gets a full PPR bump, Zay Jones. I'm not in agreement with that. I think he's going to get even fewer targets this year than last year. Maybe the same kind of ceiling, but a lower floor, very inconsistent, so I wouldn't want him for full PPR. I don't think he gets enough targets to be better in full PPR than half PPR, or even standard, really. And then standard format bumps to guys who we've already talked about. George Pickens, Jahan Dotson didn't make my list here, but I agree with that. Both of them, I think, are probably best in standard formats. That's George Pickens, Jahan Dotson. So thank you very much for watching the video. I appreciate you. Like it, comment on it, subscribe for it. More of this stuff. That concludes this little series. There will be strategy videos coming up. I will continue to do some of my best ball drafts. And really in those, I'm just looking to get a feel for the draft so that way I can help advise on strategy. And while I go through it, I explain my thought process and strategy, and just look at different types of strategies is the main thing I go into those videos with. So check those out if you haven't yet. If you're interested in just seeing that, I try to keep those tight. And yeah, thank you very much. I will see you soon.